There are jokes that stay jokes. And then there are jokes that follow you home. Follow you across 3 solar systems, through 2 decontamination bays, past a dozen alien checkpoints, and somehow, still manage to find you sitting at a military breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, staring at a cup of terrible coffee, wondering where exactly your life turned into something you'd need to explain to a tribunal. This is that second kind of joke. My name is Devin Marsh. I'm 26 years old. I am, or I was, depending on how you look at it, a corporal in the 3rd Human Expeditionary Unit, stationed aboard the outer orbital platform known as Vareth 9. We were posted there as part of the Galactic Concordat's Joint Species Integration Program. Fancy words for, humans are new here, please stop treating them like curious pets. I'm going to tell you what happened. All of it. The real version, not the cleaned-up version that ended up in the official report. The official report says, interspecies cultural misunderstanding leading to unplanned bonding contract. That's technically accurate. It's also the most misleading sentence ever written by a human hand. What actually happened was, I made a stupid joke to a vampire woman who was standing in front of me like she owned the entire universe, and she decided I meant it. Every single word of it. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand Vareth 9 before you can understand any of the rest of this. Section 1. The Station. Vareth 9 was built by the Thavari, one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy. They had been building orbital platforms for roughly 4,000 years before humans figured out that the sky was not, in fact, a ceiling. So when I say the station was impressive, I want you to understand that I'm using that word the way you'd use it to describe standing inside a living mountain. It was not a human structure. It did not think like a human structure. The corridors curved at angles that made your eyes slide sideways. The ceilings in some sections were 40 feet high, built for species that were 10, 12, 15 feet tall. The lighting was calibrated for 7 different types of vision, which meant that in most of the public zones, the air itself seemed to shimmer with frequencies you couldn't quite pin down. Blues that bled into ultraviolet, reds that dipped into infrared. Humans walked through it all with our limited little visual range and mostly just felt vaguely drunk. There were 800 species represented on Vareth 9. Humans were species 801. We'd been accepted into the Galactic Concordat 6 years prior, after what the diplomatic corps called a tense but productive negotiation period, and what the people who were actually there called the most terrifying 4 months of recorded human history. The Concordat wasn't hostile to us, exactly. We just weren't something they'd been expecting. A Class 7 Death World species that had, somehow, despite every statistical model to the contrary, developed spaceflight and emotional jazz music, and also managed not to kill itself before leaving the atmosphere. That's how one Thavari ambassador had described us in the early meetings. I had that quote on a poster in my bunk. A Class 7 Death World species that somehow survived long enough to become curious. I thought it was funny. My commanding officer, Major Reyes, thought it was a liability statement. We had 12 humans on Vareth 9, 12 out of a station population of somewhere around 40,000. We were a curiosity, a mascot with military credentials. Everyone wanted to talk to us, observe us, occasionally poke us to see what we do. What we do, generally, was get annoyed and then politely explain that we weren't here to be educational exhibits. Mostly politely. My bunk was in the human section, a cluster of 6 rooms retrofitted near the station's lower ring. The ceiling was human height. The lighting was warm and yellow. Someone had bolted a small speaker to the common room wall and it played Earth music on a loop. A mix that somebody had loaded and nobody had changed in 3 months, so by the time I'd been there 6 weeks, I could recite the track list like scripture. I didn't mind, There was comfort in it, predictability. Predictability was something Vareth 9 didn't offer in large quantities. The station was a transit hub, a research facility, a cultural exchange center, and a diplomatic way station all at once. Species came through constantly, some for hours, some for months. You'd wake up on a Tuesday and discover that a delegation of Cathari, who communicated exclusively through bioluminescent skin patterns, had taken up residence in the quadrant directly above yours, and were conducting what could only be described as extremely enthusiastic midnight conversations at full visual intensity. You adjusted, you wore the eye shields, you got on with your day. My job was Joint Security Liaison, which meant I worked with the station's alien security teams to coordinate on protocols, incident responses, and the ongoing project of explaining to everyone what humans were and weren't capable of. I carried a sidearm. I wore the uniform black and gray, with the small circular patch on my left shoulder that marked me as human, part of the Concordat's new intake program. That patch had become something of a conversation starter. Species who were curious would look at it, and then look at me, and then try to figure out whether I was something to be worried about. Usually I smiled, usually that helped. Not always. I'd been on Vareth 9 for 9 weeks when the Vairani arrived. Section 2, the VEYRANI. They came in on a diplomatic ship, sleek, dark, running on some kind of energy signature that made the station's sensors hiccup twice when it docked. I watched it come in through the observation deck. 7 other species were watching too, all of them with the particular quality of stillness that things get when they're trying not to look nervous. The Vairani. I hadn't encountered them before. I'd read the file. Everyone stationed on Vareth 9 was required to read the species files for the 60 most common visitor types, and the Vairani were in there, 3rd page, bolded header, slightly longer entry than most. The file said, the Vairani are one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the Concordat. Lifespan, measured in centuries. Dietary requirements. Non-standard, they subsist on a form of bioelectric energy harvested from compatible living organisms, a process that is entirely consensual and regulated under Concordat health directives. Social structure, deeply hierarchical, governed by bloodline seniority and merit combined. Communication style, direct to the point of what other species may experience as bluntness. Cultural note, the Vairani take verbal agreements very seriously. This is not metaphorical. The file also had a physical description, accompanied by a photograph. The photograph was not adequate preparation. The Vairani were, I'm going to say this as plainly as I can, the most disconcerting-looking species I had encountered in 9 weeks of being surrounded by species that looked like nothing I'd ever imagined. They were humanoid in the broadest possible sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, faces positioned at the front of their heads. That's where the familiarity ended. They were tall, not the towering, structural height of some alien species, but tall the way a shadow is tall, elongated, precise, possessing the impression of height even when they were standing at a moderate distance. Their skin ran from deep gray to near black, with a quality that wasn't quite reflective but wasn't quite matte either. It caught light in a way that made you want to look away and then look back. Their eyes were large, and the irises were the color of cooling metal, silver, or pale gold, or something that shifted between the two depending on the angle. Their hair, when they had it, moved with a slight autonomy that wasn't the wind. And their teeth, the file mentioned the teeth, but again, not adequate. Slightly longer canines. Not dramatically so, not the theatrical horror movie cartoons that humans associated with the word vampire, because of course, humans had already been using that word for them from the moment someone in the cultural exchange office noticed the dietary requirements. Just slightly longer, just enough that when they smiled, you noticed, and the noticing changed the quality of the smile. There were 9 of them in the diplomatic delegation, 6 support staff, 3 principals, and one who walked slightly ahead of the others, which I would later understand was not a matter of protocol but of nature. She simply moved that way, with a certainty that made space rearrange itself ahead of her. Her name, I would learn, was Sereth Vel. She was the one who found me. Or rather, she was the one I made the joke to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Section 3, Week 1. The Vairani delegation was at Vaireth 9 for purposes that were, officially, routine. There was a treaty review happening, something about border zone classifications in the outer Hellion sectors. The Vairani held territorial claims on several asteroid belts that other Concordat members wanted access to for mining operations. It was the kind of slow, grinding diplomatic process that took weeks and involved a lot of people in conference rooms looking at holographic charts and disagreeing carefully. My job was to be on the security rotation for the diplomatic wing during their stay. I did not volunteer for this. I was assigned. I found this out on a Monday morning. Major Rias called me in, sat me down across from her metal desk. She'd brought a metal desk from Earth, actual metal. It weighed approximately as much as a small car and had been transported across 3 transit hubs because she said it helped her think, and told me I'd be on the Vairani detail. Why me? I asked. Because, she said, without looking up from her paperwork, you have the lowest complaint rate of any human on this station. That's because I don't complain out loud, I said. I know, she said, that's why. So I was on the Vairani detail. The diplomatic wing was in the station's upper curve, the part that faced outward toward the star field. The corridors there were quieter, wider. The floors were a different material, something smooth and dark that reflected your footsteps back at you faintly. There were art installations at intervals along the walls, holographic pieces representing cultural contributions from the Concordat's original signatories. The Vairani contribution was a slowly rotating sequence of forms, abstract, fluid, that I spent my first shift staring at before I realized they were letters. An ancient script, words, not shapes. I asked the Thavari station officer. I was paired with what it said. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "We were here before you, we will be here after. Between those 2 facts, everything is courtesy." I thought about that for a long time. The first days were uneventful. The Vairani delegation moved between their quarters and the conference chambers on a schedule that didn't vary. They were formal, efficient. They acknowledged the security detail with a nod, a slight, precise incline of the head that communicated something like, "Your presence is noted and deemed acceptable. Please do not require anything further from us." I could work with that. The support staff were more variable. Some of them were curious about humans in the restrained, measuring way of people who had been briefed extensively and were now triangulating the briefing against the actual evidence. A few of them spoke to me on the first day. Careful questions. What was my homeworld like? How long had humans been a spacefaring species? Was it true that humans had developed artistic traditions independently in over 12,000 isolated populations before achieving global communication? Yes, I told them, more or less. They exchanged glances that I couldn't fully read. I didn't see Sereth Vel up close until the 3rd day. She came out of the conference chamber at the end of the afternoon session. Most of the delegation moved in a cluster, purposeful, unified. She came out slightly behind them, pausing in the corridor with her hands loose at her sides, and I had the impression of someone who had just spent several hours being very controlled and was now taking exactly 30 seconds to be something else. She looked down the corridor, then she looked at me. I was standing at my post, which was near the junction where the diplomatic wing met the main thoroughfare. Standard security position. I was in uniform. I had my arms at parade rest. I was doing everything correctly. She looked at me the way you look at something unexpected. Not alarmed, not particularly warm, just a calibration, A reclassification, like someone who had filed me under security detail, minor, human, and was now reconsidering the category. Then she walked away. That was the first time. Section 4. The incident in the corridor. It happened on day 7. I was coming off a 4-hour shift, heading toward the mess deck that the human section used, which was 3 levels down and on the other side of the station from the diplomatic wing. I was tired. Not miserable, just that particular tiredness you get from hours of vigilance. Your body's been ready for something that never came, and now it's quietly furious about the wasted preparation. I was walking past the observation alcove on level 4, one of the spots where the station's outer hull opened into a long, curved window overlooking the star field. It was a popular spot during ship peak hours. At this time, going on 2200 station time, it was mostly empty. Mostly. There were 3 beings in the alcove. 2 of them were galactic frontier soldiers, Corvalli, a species I recognized from the security rotation. Big, bipedal but wide, built like something that had evolved on a high-gravity world and then never really adapted away from it. They were in uniform. They were also, clearly, drunk. The Corvalli metabolized differently than most species, and their version of intoxication came on slowly and then completely, with no middle ground. They'd been somewhere serving the Corvalli-compatible neurostimulants, and now they were here, in the observation alcove, and the third being in the alcove was a Vairani. Not Sereth Vel. One of the support staff. Young, by Vairani standards, I'd learned enough to make the rough guess from the quality of stillness they had, which was less total, less deep in the younger ones. Standing near the window, a few inches from the glass, arms at their sides. The Corvalli soldiers were saying something. I didn't catch it first. Corvalli Standard had a frequency range that required translation mods to catch fully, and I had my mod running, but it was lagging slightly. What I caught was tone and posture. The Corvalli were leaning forward. The young Vairani was not leaning back, but was very still. The kind of still that is not relaxed. I stopped. The translation mod caught up. Don't need to be here. Your people don't need to be here. The whole treaty review is theater, and everyone on the station knows it. Heard what the Vairani did in the azimuth corridor. You want to tell me that's legitimate concordat behavior? The young Vairani said nothing, which I was starting to understand was a Vairani thing. They didn't argue reflexively. They assessed. They waited. They answered or they didn't, and both were deliberate. The Corvalli soldier closest to them took a step closer. I walked into the alcove. Not running, not loudly, just I walked in and I put myself in the geometry of the thing. I stood at the young Vairani's shoulder, close enough that the Corvalli had to recalibrate the angles of what they were doing. Evening, I said in Concordat Standard. The Corvalli looked at me. They were a full 1.5 feet taller than me. They outmassed me by a considerable margin. The species file on Corvalli had a physical capability section that I had read and not particularly enjoyed. I had a security patch and a sidearm and 9 weeks of practice at not looking nervous. Human, one of them said. The translation mod gave it a flat tone, but there was something dismissive in it. This isn't your concern. Everything in the diplomatic wing is my concern, I said. That's sort of the job description. We're not in the diplomatic wing. Observation Level 4 is within the wing's security radius. Station Code 14B, Annex 3. I hadn't actually memorized which specific code it was, but I said it with the confidence of someone who had, and that's mostly what matters in these situations. The Corvalli soldiers looked at each other. There's a calculation that happens in moments like this. A physical calculation, and a social calculation, and a political one. 2 drunk Corvalli soldiers versus 1 human on a security detail. The physical math was not in my favor. But the political math, involving a Vairani diplomat, a formal treaty process, And whatever Concordat regulation covered harassment of delegation members, that math pointed somewhere different. They were not stupid, just intoxicated. After a moment they left. Not quickly, they moved with the specific deliberateness of people who want it known that the leaving was their choice, but they left. I waited until they were gone. Then I turned to the young Véronique. "Are you all right?" They looked at me. The pale silver eyes were perfectly steady. I was not in danger. "I know," I said. Because I did know, actually. The Véronique file had been very clear about physical capability, and a sober Véronique was not a being that two drunk Corvallis should have been confident about confronting. But being not in danger and being accosted by two aggressive drunks in a dark corridor were different categories of thing. But it wasn't nothing. A long pause. "No," they said, "it wasn't nothing." I nodded, started to turn to leave. "You are Corporal Marsh," they said, "the human liaison." "That's me. Sarath Vel mentioned you." I turned back. She did. "She said you were observant." The young Véronique tilted their head slightly. "I understand now." They left. I stood in the observation alcove for a moment, looking out at the star field, and I thought, Sarath Vel mentioned me. I filed that away. I didn't know what to do with it yet. Section 5, the Cantina. Day 11. There was a place on Vareth 9 called the Shared Table, which was a name that made it sound much more wholesome than it was. It was the station's equivalent of a cantina, a large, low-lit space on level 7 that served food and drink synthesized for over 30 different biological chemistries, played music calibrated to be vaguely pleasant for most humanoid species simultaneously, and was staffed by a Thavari manager named Asef who had been running it for 60 years, and had the absolute unshakable calm of someone who had seen every possible thing and found most of it only moderately interesting. Off shift, it was where you went. I was there with two of my unit private Yale tours and specialist Kofi Asant. We had a corner table. Yale was eating something that smelled like spices and was technically classified as nutrition paste, but had been through enough of the synthesizer's more ambitious programming to almost resemble curry. Kofi was drinking something yellow. I had the closest approximation to coffee that the synthesizer could manage, which was not particularly close, but hit the same part of the brain in a rough sort of way. We were talking about nothing in particular. The kind of talk you do when you're tired and comfortable and don't need the conversation to go anywhere. Then the Véronique delegation walked in. All 9 of them, which was unusual. I'd never seen them use the shared table as a group, individuals sometimes, the support staff occasionally, but all 9 together was something else. They found a table. The Véronique moved through a crowd the way a current moves through water, not pushing, just redirecting. People noticed. People made space. Not out of fear exactly, but out of that instinctive recalibration you do when something fundamentally different from you enters a room. Sarath Vel sat with her back to the wall, which I noticed because I always noticed where people sat with their backs to walls. Security habit, also personal habit. We had that in common, it turned out. She was looking at the room, taking it in. Then her eyes landed on our table. On me. I did what any reasonable human being does when they make unexpected eye contact with a 700-year-old vampire diplomat across a crowded alien cantina. I nodded. She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded back. Yale, sitting across from me, had been watching. She put down her nutrition paste. "Did you just have a moment with the head Véronique?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "Marsh," Kofi said, "she's been looking at this table since they walked in. She's observant, it's a cultural thing." I picked up my not coffee. "She's still looking," Yale said, with the tone of someone narrating a nature documentary. "Yale, please eat your curry paste. It's more interesting over here." It was about 20 minutes later that HFY stood up and walked toward the bar. Not toward our table, just toward the bar where Asif was working. She moved with that absolute quality she had. No wasted motion. No uncertainty. Just direction. She passed close to our table. I don't know what possessed me. 9 weeks of tension and tedium, and the specific loneliness of being one of 12 humans in a sea of 40,000 aliens. Maybe. The 2 cups of not coffee. The fact that I was off shift and tired, and apparently my mouth decided this, was the moment to operate independently of my better judgment. She was passing within arm's reach of our table when I said it. Not loudly, just conversationally, to Yale and Kofi, as if continuing something we'd been talking about, which we hadn't. You know, if a being like that asked me to sign some kind of eternal alliance contract, I'd probably just say yes. Who's saying no to that? Yale blinked. Kofi looked at me like I'd grown a second head. HFY stopped walking. She turned her head, just her head. The rest of her stayed perfectly still, and she looked at me with those metal-colored eyes, and something happened in them, something I couldn't name, like a door opening inward in a room you didn't know was there. And then she said, in perfect concordat standard that had a quality like a cold room feels when you first walk into it. Do you know what an alliance contract is, Corporal Marsh? I had made a mistake. I understood this with complete clarity in the moment after she spoke. But I was already in it, so I did what humans do when they've started something they can't unstart. I leaned back slightly. I kept my voice easy. I said, I was joking mostly. Mostly, she repeated. That word sat in the air between us. It was a hypothetical, I said, a figure of speech. Humans do that, we say things. I know what humans do, she said. I have studied your species for longer than your species has known this station existed. This was delivered entirely without heat, which somehow made it worse. Right, I said. She looked at me for another moment, then she turned and walked to the bar. Kofi leaned across the table and said, very quietly, what just happened? I don't know, I said. You made a joke to a Vairani about an alliance contract. I didn't specify the joke, it was general. The file says they take verbal agreements seriously. I know what the file says. The file literally has a bolded note about verbal agreements. I know, Kofi. Yale was watching HFY at the bar. She's talking to Asif, she said. She keeps glancing over here. I drank the rest of my not coffee. Everything's fine, I said. Everything was not fine. Section 6, the formal request. The next morning, there was a message waiting for me. It came through the station's official interspecies communication system, the kind of message that had a header and a certification seal, and a formal language structure that meant it had been composed deliberately, not dashed off. I read it 3 times in my bunk, in the early gray light of the station's artificial dawn cycle, with the faint sound of whatever track had come up on the common room speaker bleeding through the wall. The message read, Corporal Devin Marsh, 3rd Human Expeditionary Unit, Human Concordat Liaison Division. This communication is issued in formal record, in accordance with Vairani Social Protocol, Article 7 of the Cultural Exchange Agreements governing species interaction aboard galactic concordat stations. Yesterday evening, you made a verbal statement of intent in reference to an alliance contract. Under Vairani cultural law, which is recognized as valid practice under Concordat Resolution 44 Gamma, interspecies cultural sovereignty and social agreements, a verbal statement of intent made openly in a witnessed social space carries legal weight when received in earnest by the addressed party. I received your statement in earnest. I wish to formally confirm that I heard your words and that I intend to proceed accordingly. If you wish to retract your statement, you may do so in formal writing within 48 hours of this transmission. If no retraction is received, the statement will be considered standing. Sarath Vel, third voice, House Velanthari, Vairani diplomatic delegation. I sat on the edge of my bunk for a long time. Then I went and knocked on Major Rias's door. Section 7, Major Riss. She was already awake. She was always already awake. I think she generated new work during the sleep cycle so she'd have something to do when she got up. I handed her my data tablet with the message on it. She read it once, twice. She set the tablet on her metal desk. She laced her fingers together. She looked at me the way someone looks at a situation that is going to require significant paperwork. "Corporal Marsh," she said. "Sir?" "You made a joke about an alliance contract to the third voice of House Velanthari. I was speaking to my unit. She overheard. She was within arm's reach." "Yes." "And then when she engaged with the joke." I said mostly. Major Rias closed her eyes briefly. "You said mostly," she repeated. I was trying to clarify that it was a hypothetical. "Instead you said mostly." "Yes." There was a silence. From somewhere outside her window I could hear the station's ventilation system cycling. The faint, constant, mechanical breath of a place that kept 40,000 beings alive in the vacuum. "What does an alliance contract mean?" Major Rias said. "To the Vairani." "I don't know exactly. I know the file mentioned. I'll tell you what it means." She opened a drawer in her metal desk and produced a data card that she'd clearly already pulled from the records office, which meant she'd been briefed before I got there, which meant either she'd gotten her own copy of the message or someone else had flagged the situation already. Both options were somehow worse than the other. Under Vairani social law, an alliance contract is a binding mutual pledge of association. It's entered when a Vairani chooses to extend their long-term protective covenant to a being from outside their bloodline. Think of it as a legally and culturally recognized partnership. Not romantic, necessarily, but not nothing. It creates obligations. It's taken very seriously. The file said they take verbal agreements seriously. The file understated it, Major Rias said. For the Vairani, a verbal agreement made openly in a witness space is more binding than most species' written contracts, because they've been around long enough to have seen written contracts fail. Witnessed words don't fail. Witnesses remember, and Vairani remember everything. I absorbed this. "I have 48 hours to send a retraction," I said. "You do? And if I send it, that's the end of it." She looked at me. Culturally, a retraction is complex. For the Vairani, retracting a witnessed verbal statement isn't just saying I didn't mean it. It's a formal acknowledgement that your words can't be trusted. It has implications for how they'll view human verbal communication going forward, which has implications for the treaty process currently happening on this station, which has implications for the broader concordat relationship between humanity and the Vairani. I let the full weight of that settle. "So my joke," I said slowly, "is now a diplomatic incident." "Your joke," Major Rias said, "is now sitting in the middle of a treaty process involving border zones that cover about a third of the outer Hellion sector." I sat down without being invited to sit. I think she understood. "What do I do?" I asked. Major Rias was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you what I'm required to tell you, which is that you should consult with the Interspecies Relations Office before making any decisions, and that the Human Concordat Liaison Division will support whatever course of action is diplomatically sound." "And then," I said, because I knew her well enough to know there was an and then. "And then," she said more quietly, "I'm going to tell you that Sarath Vel did not have to send that message through official channels. She could have simply let the 48 hours lapse and treated the matter as closed by your inaction. The fact that she sent a formal notice means she's giving you a real choice, which means she's taking you seriously enough to offer one." I stared at the metal desk. Which is, Major Rios said, actually kind of remarkable from what I understand of how they typically operate. I went back to my bunk. I sat there until the common room alarm went off for morning shift. I listened to whatever was playing on the speaker, something slow, something with strings. Then I did something that probably should have come with more deliberation than it got. I didn't send a retraction. Section 8, the 48 hours. I want to say that I spent those 48 hours in careful, rational reflection. What actually happened was, I walked around the station feeling like the air pressure had changed, and everything was slightly brighter and sharper than it had been, in the specific way things get when you've done something you can't undo, and your nervous system is trying to tell you that this matters. I did my shifts, I stood at my posts, I filed my reports. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, I was having approximately 900 conversations with myself, running every version of what does this mean and what are you thinking, and you understand this is not a human situation, and you understand she has been alive for longer than your entire civilization has had writing, and also, somewhere quieter, she received it in earnest. That phrase kept surfacing, in earnest. The young Vairani support staff member I'd helped in the observation alcove found me on day 2 of the 48 hours. They fell into step beside me as I was doing a routine corridor check. We walked in silence for a moment. "You haven't sent the retraction," they said. "The 48 hours aren't up," I said. "They've been up since this morning." I stopped walking. "The message was sent at 3:47 station time," they said. "You had until 3:47 today." It was 1200. I had defaulted into the decision without quite choosing it, or I had chosen it without quite deciding to. I'm not entirely sure which. Does that change? "It closes the window," they said. "The statement stands. It cannot be retracted now without formal repudiation, which is a significantly more serious process." They paused. "Sarath Vel will have been informed by the system when the window closed." "What does that mean for her?" They thought about this. I had the impression that they were choosing their words with the kind of care that Vairani used when they decided something was worth care. "It means," they said finally, "that she received your words in earnest, and now your words have been confirmed by your actions. Among my people, that is, it is not a small thing." "What's her name?" I asked. I realized I didn't know their name. I'd thought of them as the young Vairani. "Keyleth," they said. "Keyleth," I said, "I want to understand what this means, properly." "Not from the file." Keyleth looked at me. "You want me to explain what Sarath Vel has accepted by taking your words seriously?" "Yes." A pause. Sarath Vel is the third voice of House Velanthari. She has lived for 643 years. In that time she has had many allies, many associations. None of those associations have been with a human, because humans are 6 years old in concordat terms, and your people have not yet developed the relational history with us to make such contracts natural. So this is unusual. "There is no precedent," Keyleth said simply. "For our people, an alliance is a commitment across time. Vairani do not form these lightly. We form them when we have assessed a being and found that the investment of our attention and care is worth the centuries." "She's known me for 11 days. She knew of you before she arrived," Keyleth said. "Your incident reports from this station were reviewed by the delegation's cultural attaché before we docked. Your record is, you conduct yourself with specificity and care. You notice things and you act on them correctly. That is not nothing." I thought about the observation alcove, about the Corvallis soldiers, about the specific moment I'd walked into the geometry of the situation. "And the joke," I said, "my comment in the shared table." Keyleth's expression did something subtle. Sarath Vel laughed, they said. Internally, she would not express this publicly, but she told me after. She said, a human made a joke about something he understood only as a vague concept, and the joke was truer than he knew. That is either fate or a very specific kind of perception, and for Sarath Vel, either of those is worth her attention. I absorbed that. We had reached the junction at the end of the corridor. Keyleth stopped. What happens now? I asked. She will want to speak with you, Keyleth said. Formally, to establish what you actually understand about what has happened and what you intend by it. The contract must be spoken, not assumed. She'll want to have a conversation. A significant one. When she decides. I looked at the corridor. The light was shifting toward the artificial afternoon. Something was running in the ventilation, a faint harmonic. The station breathing. Keyleth, I said, can I ask you one more thing? Yes. Do you think is she doing this because it's the right move politically? To have a human under this kind of contract? Because of the treaty process and the human relationship with the Concordat? No, Keyleth said, flat, immediate, no ambiguity at all. Sarath Vel does not make personal decisions for political purposes. If she wanted to formalize relations with the human delegation for political purposes, she would have done so through official channels in a way that served her house's interests. A pause. She sent the message herself, not through her aide, not through the cultural office. She composed it and she sent it. I didn't know what to say to that. Thank you, I said. Keyleth inclined their head, started to walk away, then stopped. She watched you in the observation alcove, they said, without turning around. When you walked in on the Corvalli, she was 3 meters down the corridor in the maintenance alcove, monitoring the situation. She was going to intervene. She had already decided to. She didn't need to, She knows that now, Keyleth said. She did not know it then. A pause, but you moved first. They left. I stood in the corridor for a while. She was going to intervene, but you moved first. She sent word on day 14. A simple message, not the formal language of the first one, shorter, different in tone. The observation deck, upper ring 2100, if it suits you. If it suits you, as though it was casual. As though it was a suggestion. I wore my good uniform. I'm telling you that because it matters somehow. I was aware of doing it, aware of the small deliberateness of it, aware that it was a choice that communicated something even if I couldn't have articulated what. I brushed the jacket. I checked the patch on my shoulder. The upper ring observation deck was one of the largest open spaces on the station, a wide curve of floor, and a ceiling that was effectively entirely transparent, looking out at the star field in 180 degrees of depth. At night cycle it was breathtaking. The stars of the outer Hellion belt were dense here, more points of light per degree of sky than anything I'd grown up seeing from Earth. The galaxy's arm was visible as a pale, dense band. She was already there. She was standing at the far end of the deck, near the window, with her hands clasped behind her back, and the star field in front of her, and the slight autonomous movement in her dark hair that I'd noticed the first day. She was in Veyrani formal wear, not the diplomatic uniform but something personal, deep gray that picked up the starlight. I walked to where she was standing. I stopped a few feet away. For a moment neither of us said anything. The star field was there, the station hummed. Corporal Marsh, she said. You can call me Devin, I said, if that's acceptable. She turned to look at me. Devin, she said it like she was checking the weight of it. You understand what the lapse of the retraction window means. Keyleth explained it to me. Did you allow the window to close intentionally? I thought about that. I think, I said, that I made a decision without quite noticing I was making it, which might be a very human way of making decisions. Something happened in her expression, not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. I have studied your species, she said. You make decisions in layers. The rational mind and the instinctive mind rarely work in sequence. You decide and then you understand that you decided. That's accurate, I said. What do you actually know about what you've agreed to? She asked, direct, not unkind. Not much, I admitted. I know the file, which apparently understated everything significantly. I know what Keyleth told me. I know that for the Vairani, an alliance is a long-term commitment that involves care and mutual obligation. I know it's not entered lightly. I paused. I know you've been alive for 643 years, and I've been alive for 26, which means I'm going to need you to tell me what I'm not understanding. She turned back toward the window. Sit down, she said. This will take time. There was a ledge running along the inner side of the window. I sat. She remained standing, but she half-turned so she could see both the window and me. A Vairani alliance contract, she said, is not romantic in the human sense. Though it can develop that dimension over time and the contract encompasses it if it does, it begins as something more fundamental. She paused. My people live a very long time. That means we outlive nearly everything and everyone we connect with. Other species, other relationships, other contexts. The long life can become a form of isolation if you allow it to. The alliance contract is a way of creating meaningful connection across the lifespan, committing to be genuinely present to another being, to share information, care, protection, history, to treat their concerns as real and worth your attention. For how long? I asked. The contract runs for the natural span of the shorter-lived party's life, she said. In your case, whatever humans in your medical era can expect. After which it is considered fulfilled, and the Vairani party carries the alliance in memory. And what does it mean in practice? She was quiet for a moment, gathering words with precision. I would have a responsibility toward your safety, not to shield you from things that are yours to navigate, but to ensure that you are not harmed by things you cannot see coming. In exchange, you would have a responsibility toward transparency, to tell me when you require assistance rather than attempting to manage everything alone. My people have spent centuries learning that the most dangerous thing for a human-scale being in this galaxy is navigating it without allies who can read the currents they cannot see. What currents? The Corvallis soldiers in the observation alcove, she said simply. You neutralized them with presence and regulation knowledge. That was effective. But those two soldiers are members of a unit whose commanding officer has filed 3 separate complaints against the Vairani delegation since we arrived, and is currently in communication with a faction within the Concordat that is seeking to challenge the treaty process. If they had escalated, it would not have been a random incident. It would have been the beginning of a documented pattern. I stared at her. You know all of that. I have been reading this station's political weather for 2 weeks, she said. I knew it before I arrived. I know things that are not in any report you would have access to. And you're offering to share that. I'm offering to make you aware of the things that are happening around you that you cannot currently see, she said. Because you are 26 years old, and you are doing your job very well for someone who has been in this galaxy for 9 weeks, and that is not sufficient protection for the environment you are actually in. I sat with that for a while. What do you get, I asked, from this arrangement? She looked at me then, really looked. And I understood that it was a question she hadn't been expecting, which meant it was a question that mattered. When I was young, she said, and the word young from a 600-year-old being landed differently than it does anywhere else, a being from a species I had never encountered before walked into a dangerous situation that was not their responsibility and handled it with neither violence nor submission. Simply presence, clarity, correct action. She paused. In 6 centuries, I have seen many things. I have seen very few beings who do that by instinct rather than calculation. I thought about the observation alcove, about walking in and just standing there, in the geometry. That's why, I said. That and you made me laugh, she said. In a week that had been exceptionally tedious, the not quite smile again, Your joke was truer than you knew, Devin Marsh. I told you it was mostly a joke. You told me it was mostly a joke, she said, which means it was, at minimum, partly earnest. I couldn't argue with that. We talked for 3 hours. I'm not going to put all of it here. Some of it was mine and hers to keep. But the shape of it was, she explained, and I asked questions and she answered them. And at some point the conversation stopped being formal and became something else, something easier, with spaces in it that didn't require filling. She told me about the Hellion sector, about the currents I hadn't been able to see, about the Corvallis unit and their commanding officer, and the 3 Concordat factions currently treating the treaty process as a proxy conflict for something much larger about human integration and resource access. She told me this matter-of-factly, with the precision of someone reading a map, and I sat there and absorbed it and felt the particular sensation of a world getting more complicated in a direction that made it more real. She asked me questions too. What was Earth like? What was it like to be one of 12 humans in 40,000? What did I want from this posting? Not the official answer, the real one. Whether I found the galaxy frightening or fascinating or both. Both, I told her, mostly both. She said that's the right answer. And she said it with something in her voice that I couldn't name but that I felt. Before I left, she produced a data card, not a message, an actual physical card, the kind the Veyrani used for significant documents. Small, dark, with text in the ancient script on one side and Concordat standard on the other. This is the contract language, she said. Standard Veyrani form, adapted for the duration of a human lifespan and the current Concordat legal framework. I've had the Cultural Office review it for compliance. You should read it, and if you have questions, ask them. And if you wish to have a human legal advisor review it, that is your right. I took the card, looked at the ancient script, which I couldn't read, turned it over to the Concordat standard side. It was short, simpler than I expected. Most of it was what she described: mutual presence, mutual obligation, information sharing, protection within the limits of what was mine to manage. There was a section near the end, in slightly different formatting, that I read twice. This alliance is entered as a recognition of specific qualities: steadiness, clarity, willingness to act correctly when action is required. These qualities are the foundation. Whatever other dimensions the alliance may develop, it is on this foundation that it rests. I looked up. She was watching me. The section at the end, I said. Yes. That's the why, I said. That's the why, she confirmed. I looked at the card for a long moment. The star field was still there behind her, the thick arm of the galaxy pale and constant. I don't have 6 centuries of perspective, I said. I'm 26 and I've been in space for 9 weeks. I'm probably going to misread situations. I'm definitely going to say things wrong. I made a joke that started this whole thing. I know, she said. That doesn't. I just want to make sure you know what you're committing to. She looked at me, and the metal silver of her eyes had that quality again, that door-opening inward thing, and she said quietly, I have lived for 643 years, Devin. I know exactly what I am committing to. Do you? A pause, the station breathed. The stars didn't move. Yes, I said. Then say so. I know what I'm committing to. She held out her hand. Not a human handshake. The Veyrani form was slightly different, the palm facing up, a gesture that I'd read about in the file as an offering rather than a clasp. I put my hand in hers. Her grip was cool and careful and completely steady. Then it is spoken, she said, and witnessed. She tilted her head slightly toward the window, toward the stars. The sky is witness enough by our tradition. I looked out at the galaxy. The sky is witness enough.